Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to our third talk from the Insight series from Olwg. Today we're going to be talking about innovation and the socio-technological transition. Simon, our commercial director, is going to be giving us a 15-minute really interesting talk on that topic based on his own research. And after that, we're going to go to a panel discussion which should last about 30 minutes. So very pleased today to be able to welcome Ian Donald, Henry Allen, and Dr. Chen. I'll make introductions to those gents later on before we start the panel discussion. I would say that as we go through Simon's talk and throughout the session, the Q&A box will be open to participants and audience members to post questions. So I would encourage you to put questions in the box as we go, and then as we come to the panel session, we'll read these out. So just a brief introduction to Simon. So Dr. Simon Stromberg, so he's a commercial director for Olwg. Simon's an experienced leader in the energy industry. He's got a strong technical background in various topics, including subsurface. And he's got the ability to integrate multiple disciplines to deliver projects. And Simon's currently studying for an MSc in energy policy at the University of Sussex. So on that note, I will hand over straight to Simon. And Simon, the floor is yours for 15 minutes or so.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about innovation and technology in the context of energy transition, carbon reduction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why innovation is not exactly the same thing as technology, why transitions can take long, and why innovation, particularly in energy transition, is socially complicated. And it's very socially complicated, yet if you do a quick search on the internet or you looked at LinkedIn, the agenda is dominated by engineers and economists, but it's actually probably 50% a social transition. So I'll just move on to the next slide. So innovation isn't just about technology. So a good definition of innovation is actually the successful commercialization of technology. And that relies often on systems integration across a multiplicity of skills, disciplines, public and private institutions. And particularly when we're talking about energy transition and climate change, that includes social and political elements. So it's really important to understand that innovation isn't just technology as physical artifacts, as in things, as is a hydrogen electrolyzer, a carbon capture storage installation. It also includes ideas about how you improve systems and production systems if you want to bring the cost of things down. Development of supporting organisations that can make those innovations happen, but also social development. And perhaps on the left-hand side of this slide, perhaps the most interesting paper or one of the best papers is one by Gales and Socio-Technological and Schwein and Sorrell that looks at how innovation really works. And the idea is that innovation develops from a niche innovation through to technical adoption and finally into the mainstream. Niche innovations generally involve new entrants. They tend to be radical. They tend to be very much on the fringe of existing systems. They do carry a high degree of uncertainty. There's a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of entry and exit. There's a lot of failure. And you get lots of those. And at some point, dimensions become aligned around those and start to dominate, stabilize into dominant designs. Momentum increases. And then those innovations start to break through into the mainstream. They actually start to move into the public consciousness. and eventually they move into the social technical landscape. So they become part of that social technical landscape. And two good examples are perhaps hydrogen as an energy format for cars and home heating, and wind. Wind is pretty much now in the mainstream. It's really part of the social technical landscape. There's lots of wind farms. People know about them. They're part of our energy mix. But hydrogen is still in the niche phase, and hydrogen is competing with a lot of other niches. And really, we're going from science to technology to social. Science is really important at the bottom. Now, one of the big challenges here is that in innovation, this bottom phase and creating a broad platform of lots of ideas is the most important part of innovation, the creation of the science. And there is an argument that that is where government should provide support for things that aren't in the social technical landscape, that aren't attracting investment. And it's really important that governments don't try and pick winners, but support a multitude of potential options. Once you get into technology, then government role really starts to turn into something around incentivization of adoption. There's also an element of what we call creative destruction, and creative destruction is where we introduce policy to remove old technological regimes. So we want to move from internal combustion engines to electric cars. So we introduce policies that incentivize electric cars, but we also introduce policies that disincentivize internal combustion engines. So, for example, we might tax petrol and diesel more heavily. So that's a really nice model to look at. So the other important thing is that whenever you look at innovation at a point in time, you're only seeing a snapshot. And what's really important to realize is that technologies tend to come and go before they get adopted. So there might be 2, 3, 4 attempts to introduce a technology before it gets really introduced. And this is from another paper by Giles, which looks at carbon technical, social technical analysis of low carbon transitions. It's looking specifically at transport. And actually this tracks interest in various technologies. So in the early 1990s, battery electric, battery electric interest kind of fell away actually during the late 1990s. And there was a big rise in interest in hydrogen fuel cells. Then biofuels came along, and then hybrid electric. And what you can see from this is that right now, battery electric is really now starting to be more widely adopted. Hybrid electric, well, that's kind of waning because governments have kind of said they're not going to support hybrid electric, they want pure electric. Biofuel is starting to pick up again. And fuel cells kind of were big in sort of the early 2000s, dropped off, but again are coming back into the public domain. So the visibility in society and policy debates and technology debates changes all the time. And it's only under a specific set of circumstances that you get a window that opens up that allows mainstream adoption of these technologies. So there's often waves of technology where it comes and goes before it becomes finally adopted. And really it's a question of broadening up and narrowing down. And actually this is a really good case study. It's another paper by Giles, and it looks at transition pathway from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles, which is a really interesting technological transition. Now, the first thing to know about it is that transition started in 1870, and there wasn't really wide adoption until the late 1930s. So we're talking about a 60-year period before things became adopted. Now, there are elements of technology that had to evolve. So we went from steam engines to gasoline engines, electric motors. And actually, what's really interesting, the first vehicles that were really adopted on the road that had any real use weren't internal combustion engines, but electric cars. So New York had electric taxis in the late 1890s, early 1900s, before they had internal combustion petrol fueled or diesel fueled taxis. And there was a lot of other competition. So there was horse buses, there was electric trams, there was bicycles, the automobile. The automobile began to grow to 1910. The bicycle was kind of started, but never really, it's quite widely adopted, but not really for mass transport. But around 1910, 1920, the big dominant transport was electric tram. And those electric trams dropped away and we moved over to the automobile. Now, the reason that happened wasn't just because of the technology, it was because of some major societal changes. So there was two reasons really the electric tram failed. The first reason was decentralisation of the workplace. So the tram stations were built on a radial system that went from the suburbs, the outside of towns, into the centre of towns. And if you wanted to go anywhere, generally you'd have to go from the outside to the central hub and back out again. But industry moved out of cities. So it was taking a long time for people to go to work. So if you might, as the crow flies, only be 10 miles away from your work, but you might have to go all the way into town, all the way back out again on your tram to get there. The other thing that happened is that the tram companies built a very big, large, profitable companies. And there was a public perception that they were running a monopoly, that they were fleecing the general public. The third thing that happened was there was a rise in leisure time. So from the 1800s into the 1900s, people actually started working less, they get more leisure time. And this whole idea of touring the countryside came up. And people started using bicycles first to tour the countryside. And then they started using early automobiles. The final thing that really nailed automobiles was actually an economic downturn. It was the Great Depression in the United States. In the 1930s, the Great Depression meant there were a lot of men unemployed. So the government came up with a scheme to put a lot of that unemployed workforce on the building of roads. And there was a massive road building program. And that really opened up the infrastructure required from the automobile. So what you learn from that case study is that yes, technology is important, but it's the social, economic transition that really makes innovation happen. And that's a really important point, I think, when you look at innovation. Let's turn our attention to carbon capture and storage. This is a piece of work I did last year, which was looking at the transition of carbon capture and storage. And one of the most important things when you look at anything, any innovation, any transition, particularly something that requires government policy intervention like carbon capture and storage, is there are a multitude of actors. And this diagram looks complicated, but it's there for a reason. So there's a whole bunch of actors that are either trying to drive CCS onto the agenda or block it from getting onto the agenda. And this is a model which is called Birkeland's agenda universe, where things move from a systematic agenda to a decision agenda through the institutional agenda. So you're trying to get things that are being talked about onto the decision agenda. And you'll have a whole bunch of people trying to force things into that decision agenda and a whole bunch of people trying to actually force it out. And actually the same groups may be doing both. So you'll have expert advisors that are saying carbon capture is a terrible idea. You'll have expert advisors that are saying it's a great idea. Consumers may not want carbon capture and storage. They may be worried about it. They may not understand it. You have investors who are looking to invest. You have climate change science. You have pressure groups. You have industrial emitters. So carbon capture and storage relies on carbon tax. So you've got people who are emitting carbon and going to try and block that. But there's also an interesting group that appeared, which is what I call the reformed industrial emitters. So you've now got people who used to be industrial emitters that believe it's good for their business to be in the public eye and trying to do something about it. So they play in both directions. And right now, I would argue that carbon capture and storage, carbon removal by CCS, is currently on the institutional agenda, trying to force its way into a decision agenda. In the UK, and I'm talking about the UK, there isn't really any major approved carbon capture storage project yet, but we're expecting them to come. So they've been on the institutional agenda for a while, and we're trying to get them onto the decision agenda. So another way of looking at this is what we call a multi-level perspective. And the idea is that you have streams within innovation and policy that interact, that either diverge or converge. So down this axis, I've got time. I've got a bunch of different actors involved in the energy transition. So we've got government, we've got inside actors, people who are involved in the technology. We've got business and investors, so businesses who are interested in it, investors who want to invest in it, the media, and grassroots advocacy. So by grassroots advocacy, I mean NGOs, I mean Extinction Rebellion, the World Wildlife Fund. And what's really interesting is the way those streams evolve often depends on how events happen in the world. So there are key focus events that force the focus onto that agenda. And I've just mapped out some of the things. So actually in 1997, we had the Kyoto Agreement. 2000, the UK introduced their climate change programme. And then the big one for the UK was the 2008 UK Climate Change Act. And about the same time, the Macondo oil disaster happened. And then shortly afterwards, we had the 2012 Green Deal. And actually at that time, there was a huge amount of interest in climate change, carbon reduction, but then something happened. We had actually at this time, we had a big economic recession. And government became very, very focused on the banking crisis, the economic recession about that time. And so government lost a bit of interest. And kind of interest really fell away. And it wasn't really until 2016 we started to see more reports come out. And then the big thing that really hit the media, that really dominated the media, is something I term the Thunberg effect and Extinction Rebellion. And there was a period I remember where Extinction Rebellion were all over the news. And about that time, it was the hot topic. Government responded, and we had the 2019 UK net zero by 2050. And then we saw a whole bunch of announcements. We saw Royal Bank of Scotland pulling out of funding major oil producers. COVID-19 happened, and COVID-19 started to become associated with an idea of a reset, with a green recovery. Bayes announced 800 million for a reinvigorated CCS project. And then Bayes are now introducing new energy cluster models. They are producing business models. So right now, a policy window is open. We've got a period where we've got a policy window open where the streams are converging to drive forward the innovation. The point about policy windows, they only open up for so long. So if you actually look at the history, there was a policy window around 2012, which fell away. And in fact, in 2015, all of the carbon capture and storage projects in the UK were cancelled after we spent 100 million on basically looking at the feasibility of those projects. Now they're coming back into fashion. And the point is that innovation is a social thing. It moves forward in a social way. What's really interesting is you can get a lot of this information. I constructed a lot of this information by looking at historical searches on the internet. So you can use something called Google search, and you can actually look at what people, you can put in search terms, you can find out what people are interested in. So it's not really that scientific. You have to do a lot of QA/QC on the data, but just as a quick example, I looked at some current energy technologies and whether or not they're in the public eye. Now, if you're an engineer or somebody in energy, you're on the LinkedIn energy forums, you know, hydrogen is a really hot topic. But when you actually look at it compared to other things, is it actually in the public domain? So I've looked at climate change, I've looked at the electric car, I've looked at hydrogen cars, hydrogen energy and hydrogen fuel. So climate change is really interesting. You can see that peak. There's the peak associated with when Greta Thunberg first appeared and Extinction Rebellion really hit the headlines. It sort of died away again, it's picked up again. Electric cars have had this gradual kind of increase, a bit of a drop off during COVID-19 when people were less worried about what vehicle they were driving and more worried about jobs. But again, a steady rise. Anything to do with hydrogen, consistently low level. It's never really been in the public domain. So there's a lot of technical talk about it. There's a lot of policy talk about it, but it's not in the public domain. And I read a really interesting article yesterday. Somebody had posted that hydrogen was going to happen because we'd had an election recently in the UK. We had an election this week, and we elected our government in Scotland. And Scotland actually do have a policy for hydrogen. And somebody has said, well, the SNP, the Scottish National Party, have been re-elected. On their policy agenda is hydrogen. Therefore, they have a mandate from the public to enact hydrogen as an energy solution. Well, they don't, because it's on their policy, but there's absolutely been no discussion at all in the last election about hydrogen. There's actually been very little discussion about the green agenda from what, and Henry and Ian may comment. Most of the discussion has been about recovery from COVID-19, about Scottish becoming independent. And actually, if you look at the polls, the Green Party in Scotland polled 1.8% of the public vote. So electric cars are interesting because it's a technology everybody understands. You can get excited by electric cars. Car companies are pushing it. Climate change comes and goes, very much driven by media presence. Certain specialist niche vectors like hydrogen, very low level, not really in the public domain, still sitting in that niche, still needs a lot of pushing to push it forward if it's going to become a dominant energy vector. So, you know, in conclusion, we need to look at innovation not just as technology. It's not an engineering and science problem. It's also a social problem, and it's a social transition problem. And actually, as engineers and scientists, what we think is in the public domain may not actually what is in the public domain. If you don't have public buy-in, these transitions won't happen. These technologies don't take off. And that's where I'll leave it for now. Open to questions.
Thanks, Simon. That was really good. I know we've talked about some of this stuff before, but there are a few points there that prompted some questions in my head, which I'll maybe put to the panel very shortly. So thanks for that. That was good. What I'll do now, I'll come on to introduce the panel. So we pulled the panel together as individuals who have lived and breathed innovation and gone through that process for a number of years and can offer some different perspectives there based on real life experience. So let me introduce the three panelists. So firstly, I'll introduce Henry Allen. So from a background as a geologist in oil and gas, Henry worked for Britol and BP, left in 1990 to set up Production Geoscience Limited, or PGL, who are a subsurface consultancy and software development business. In 2007, this became part of the Synergy Group. After that, Henry carried a leading role at group level, championing issues around people, environment and community, as well as helping instigate Synergy's alternative energy business. So Henry served on a wide variety of industry, society and advisory committees, as well as local community organisations. And I'd say as well that Henry's also one of our business advisors to Olwg. I'll introduce Ian Donald. Ian is also an advisor to Olwg. So Ian was founder and CEO of Enpro Subsea. Enpro was basically a production optimization specialist focusing on delivering enhanced hydrocarbon production through patented products. So Ian was responsible for the company development and technology from conception through to commercialization and subsequent acquisition by Hunting PLC last year. Prior to Enpro, Ian was founder and managing director of DES Operations, which produced a patented Mars system, which was a subsea oil production enhancement system. And with a great team and VC funding, Ian was able to grow the company from initial patents through development, deployment, and commercialization with major operators, and then eventual acquisition by Cameron. Ian's been engaged in the subsea and field development aspects of the offshore energy business for over 35 years, fulfilling board executive, technical, and project management roles. Welcome, Ian. And I'll also introduce Dr. Chen. So Dr. Chen is an expert on purification of biomolecules in pharmaceutical manufacturing and has done research with companies including GSK, Pfizer, Lonza, and Fujifilm over the past 10 years. Dr. Chen has also been an active educator in the London startup ecosystem, running the Startup Leadership Programme as the co-programme lead for education and operation over the past 5 years. So yeah, a warm welcome to our panelists. I'm just looking to see if there's any Q&A from the attendees. There isn't at the moment, so I'd encourage those online. Any questions you'd like to put to the panel, please post them through the Q&A box. I guess I'll maybe start off with, so I guess I'd be interested as we go to the panel in, any observations and contributions you've got on Simon's talk. I'll maybe start off with one of my own. So I guess one of the themes, maybe for me, one of the things I hadn't thought about before is that there seems to be this concept of the right time for an innovation. So if you've got a superb idea, or it's a superb technology, or you think it fits, if it's not quite the right time, or if it's ahead of its time, then it's not going to work. So I'm kind of interested in how does an innovator gauge whether it is the right time? And I'm kind of wondering as well whether tools like the Google Trends function, does that perhaps have any practical application in helping to, understand that the kind of backdrop and the scene regarding whether the right time is now. So that was my thought. So let me hand over to the panel then. Maybe Henry, why don't you start? Do you have any thoughts, observations?
Yeah, I could kind of follow on from that question you posed there, Tony. There are so many different ways that innovation can happen, and I'll start by looking at a non-energy example, which is a classic example, which is the iPhone. And the iPhone has been so successful because it combined technological innovation, which was coming from all sorts of different directions, the hardware, the internet, etc. But also fashion comes into it, and this comes back to the societal thing, which Simon was alluding to, is that innovation really works, especially when you start bringing in market forces. It really works if something becomes fashionable, and so the iPhone is just a perfect example of that. Now, the energy world is a very different beast, because we're talking about a life supporting area which people have no choice about, really. We all need it or want it. We probably, it's differing degrees, but we all need it, and we all are forced to pay for it and buy it. So the changes, trying to get innovation and changes in the energy world is a very, very different thing. And Simon talked about wind now being kind of mainstream, but I'm not sure you'd call it fashionable or not. You could look at solar PVs and see how they've progressed over the years, and they've broken through. They needed mass production to bring costs down, so there was a big catch-22 for many years early on trying to get it going, and through various mechanisms it probably is. Whether it's fashionable yet, it's fairly, you look around, you see a lot of solar PVs around, but is it fashionable? I don't know. But if you go back to a point in time that Simon alluded to, which was the financial crash. Now, I remember the time before that there was a huge emphasis on energy efficiency, use of technology to optimize usage. It was a really, really big thing. It was clearly being very pushed. I remember going to talks by Ian Marchant, who was then the CEO of Scottish Hydro, and he's a great speaker, and really inspiring actually to listen to. And there he was selling electricity, but also promoting changes in behaviour. His big emphasis was on changes in behaviour, along with the investment that they would be making. But what was under all that was the fact that this was all going to cost a huge amount of money. And around the time of the financial crash, there was a huge emphasis, maybe there was an election going on, but basically people were starting to realize that electricity prices were going up because of the investment in the energy transition. And Simon pointed out that the governments lost interest after the financial crash, and that was clearly a very political thing, because people were really putting their feet down and saying, we're not going to pay for all this environmental stuff. Why should we have to pay for it all? And it became very unfashionable. So these are the forces that are going on in the energy world. How do you get society to buy into the need to do this stuff and to invest and to pay for it? And that's very, very difficult. And it's really only when you get people thinking, if people really, really think it's a crisis, will they really come on board? It's one way of looking at it. And Greta Thunberg certainly had a temporary effect, but we're a long way near people really buying into all this, I think, from the point of view of public perception. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Henry. Ian, do you have any thoughts on that? Oh, Ian, I think you're muted.
I did earlier, Tony. Apologies. First one today. Yeah, no, I think the emphasis on culture is a key one. You know, we all, the license to operate that we've seen, the change in the cultural attitude to the oil and gas. I think Henry and I think I got some grants from Brit Oil when I was doing masters. That was a long time ago, and it was seen as a massive economic saviour for the UK and Scotland at that time. And it's come full circle now to being seen as something which is kind of time it was done, if possible. But the cultural buy-in to do the change is tricky. You know, once again, Simon touched on it when it came to cars. One of the drivers was the roads. You know, if there was no roads, then you were almost more certain to get there on your horseback. You know, but once you had a road building program, you created took away the infrastructure impediment, and you know, you could then use cars in much wider distribution. So I think it'll be interesting to see which technologies succeed and you know, going into the mainstream based on some of that you know, the infrastructure to support them. I don't know if the rest of the panel have thoughts on the amount of energy, the amount of money actually and time it would take to produce usable infrastructure for each of these alternatives.
So I think infrastructure is a big problem when you look at certain energy vectors. I mean, infrastructure of charging points for cars, upgrading the grid to take the sheer amount of electricity you're going to need. How do you transport hydrogen around the world? And the other observation I make on the car transition and the death of, well, not the death of the horse, but the move from a horse to city centres, part of the reason was environmental. Because at one point, I think in London, there was something like, you know, 1.5, 2 million horses in London. So you can imagine what effect that has on your streets. So actually, one of the drivers for moving from horses to cars was actually environmental, because of the stabling and the amount of horse manure that built up in city areas. And they had a massive workforce that all they did was remove horse manure from the streets.
Yeah.
So it is interesting. Maybe Chen has something to say from his perspective.
Yep. Maybe I will. I'm not going to comment on you know, energy, you know, sector per se, because I come from more like a pharmaceutical sector. So, but I also come from an academic background. So I think I would like to echo some of the messages shared by Simon. So I think innovation definitely takes a long time, But what I want to say is, innovation is mainly driven by competition, especially among companies or professionals or academics, and this kind of competition will just go on, and sometimes I think the idea about the government involvement, I think is quite important in the sense that government funding and support is essential at the beginning, where innovations in universities or research institutes need this kind of support. But once the let's say the technology is developed, or for example the protocol is the prototype is developed, then the commercial people can actually come in to try to make it more sustainable. But I do agree. So for example, I'm sure pharmaceutical industry is quite a slow developing industry. So it takes a very long time to develop new technologies or new drugs. Yeah. So I do agree that it takes time. Yeah.
Actually, I have a broader question for you there, Chen, actually, which is there is a big debate at the moment between what we call the neoliberalists, which is the market decides, government keep out of it. And what is unusual about this transition is where governments are intervening. So governments are choosing to intervene on technologies that are already understood. So fuel cells, we know how they work. We know how hydrogen works. But they're really starting very, very, they are really starting to try and create the market through subsidies, through legislation, through taxation, Pigouvian taxes. Do you think that works, or are you more on the market should decide end of the spectrum? Because it's a massive debate in policy circles at the moment.
Yeah, I think is I think that the involvement of government differs at different stages. So as I said, at the very early stages, it's more like I would say the government will play a dominant role, okay, in encouraging this. But slowly, the government should, be stepping back, and allow market to come in. So, but what I observe is that because I've been also doing this education in the London ecosystem, what I observe is that clean tech is a very special type of sector. Clean tech needs heavy support from the government, and also it also needs to deal with government heavily. Even the government, even the market is developed. So for example, right? I mean, let's use an example. Let's say Uber, right? So Uber is actually a very simple. I mean, in my opinion, it's actually a very simple idea. It's not rocket science technology, but it is actually down to the government to update their legislation to support this kind of sharing economy. Okay, and then you can see that actually there are a lot of government which are kind of not allowing this to take place. So you can see that actually Uber is actually doing quite well in California, but sometimes in other parts of the world like Europe, because of maybe some sort of conservative thinking is not so successful. So what I'm trying to say is, clean tech is really special. That government always need to play a role as a policy maker, that always try to support new innovations.
Thanks for that. I guess a question I had, which is related to what you're saying, Wen. I'm kind of wondering whether, I think having heard some of the points made today, do you think that how innovation works or how it works in real life, is it kind of the same now as it was back, say, in the 1870s? So it's kind of a timeless concept, or actually is it different now compared to 30 years ago in in the way that, you know, government support may be more structured, or the whole startup ecosystem is a bit more established? Do we think it's different now from the past, or kind of roughly the same? So I guess that's the general question to all the panel members.
Well, nothing's the same, really. I would say it has to be different now. To my mind, this is a very different situation from, if you like, opportunistic innovation, which obviously is the reason why we're here now. Really, is opportunistic innovation based on certain big events, probably, such as the advent of coal and steam and such like. But now we're facing something where we can see a future that's not quite here, and we're having to deal with it. And I do think leadership and government intervention or government leadership is absolutely critical, or it just won't happen.
I have to agree with that, Henry. It's quite odd, isn't it? You know, the exploitation route of innovation, almost without thought of the consequences, has been the driver for industrialization in most countries. But now, if you have to take a more broader view of the one planet view, then it's going to have to change. But that requires intergovernmental input, which is, I can't remember, the naysayers would say we produce very little of the world's carbon dioxide, and if we became net zero tomorrow, then the impact on the planetary change would be zero. So there's government, big government has a huge role to play to try and bring a global recognition and visibility to that, and that's probably going to be the deciding factor, isn't it?
Yeah, the dialogue around that's really interesting. So the dialogue around who's responsible for carbon emissions is, well, to date, the developing nations are responsible for most of the carbon. The UK industrialised early, so we produced a lot that's in the atmosphere. 2, we're a net importer of carbon. So the government figures, a recent study suggests government figures have overestimated our carbon reduction considerably because we don't account for the amount of carbon we've offshored and then re-import as goods. So that's an interesting thing. The other thing that becomes really interesting, I think, to go back to is it different, Tony, you asked? I think it is. The car transition was market driven. The reason trams failed is because of market conditions, because people they wanted to buy something else, they wanted to make a different choice. At the moment, there's some really interesting things, and it's all wrapped up with policy choice and, you know, ideas around policy choice theory. There's a lot of money, there's a lot of government interest, there's a lot of government money actually available for energy transition. So there's a lot of people trying to extract value from that system. So we have, you know, people who are lobbying government, we have policy entrepreneurs who have solutions and trying to demonstrate their solution is relevant. You know, so almost everybody's trying to demonstrate what they do will improve the situation regards climate change. There's a lot of people rent seeking as well, trying to demonstrate that their technology is actually the best when it might not be, and extract rents from government. And actually the Uber case is really interesting. So the reason it struggles in New York is because in New York there's a fixed number of taxi licenses. Most taxi licenses currently exchange at a cost of about $1 million each. If you want to buy a taxi license in New York, it'll cost you $1 million roughly. And so there's more value in the taxi licenses than there is in providing a taxi service. So there's a market failure. So there's an enormous lobby group, a very powerful lobby group in the United States, a lot of powerful businessmen, politicians who actually own taxi licenses that lobby government to stop Uber on the basis that Uber's not safe or Uber doesn't do this. The motivation is the value of those taxi licenses, because as soon as Uber come and disrupt that market, those £1 million taxi licenses will be worth a lot less. So when you look at innovation, you need to realise that there's a whole, especially something that's big like this, there's a lot of vested interests. So does the market decide? Yes and no. But right now, it's not really, energy transition is not a free market, I would argue. Not like transition to cars. I think you've got a question that just popped up. Two questions, Tony.
Yeah. I was just going to read them out. Thanks for that. So we've got a couple of questions. I'm just keeping an eye on the time a little bit, but we've got time to read these out. So the first one is not CCUS application driven by industry transition, not societal products?
Yes, it is driven by people who have solutions that feel they can fit it into a government policy that requires decarbonisation. So there's a lot of vested interest from established companies that want to use their existing technology to fit that space.
Yeah.
So oil and gas companies want to be involved in CCUS because it's just reverse engineering for them. So I think, and I'll open it up to the panel, I would argue it is very much driven from a technology point of view. I don't think the public really talk about capture and carbon storage a lot, is my impression. And I think it's exploiting a policy window. Any other people? Henry, do you have a thought on that?
Yes, that's kind of where you are. I've got very mixed feelings about it. There is an argument for it where there are very clear-cut major point sources and you can demonstrate some efficiency and impact. But looking at it globally, the cost is just phenomenal, and for the impact that you get, as far as I can see,
is tiny.
Yeah, it's hugely expensive. Plant trees. Okay, I'll read out the second comment that was made here. So societal scrutiny is more important as local communities see actual harm from climate change to their social and natural capital. Yeah. So I think, yeah, people are waking up to, that the harm that's being done to the planet. I'm just wondering how that then translates to, I guess some of the technology transitions for clean energy, some of it's, I guess, more visible or relatable to the public. There's lots of examples of that. I guess CCUS is an example where, it's a lot more industrial and not really visible to the general public.
If I could come back to the leadership thing, I mean, yes, the public awareness is going up, and it helps enormously. We don't, for instance, have a president in the US that was completely poo-pooing it. So it's going in the right direction. The time, though, is a huge issue. You could maybe look at the example of cigarette smoking, which was very fashionable and is now, I dare say, generally unfashionable. Now, how long has it taken us to get here with smoking? And that definitely, it was with the help of huge government intervention and leadership on that. So, how are we going to have that sort of impact on the climate and energy side that we've achieved on smoking over how many decades is that? 3 or 4 decades, is it?
40, 50 years. Probably go back to the 1960s when people first really realised smoking was pretty bad for you. Yeah. Maybe in the 50s. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. So I'm guessing by the way the person's phrased that question, they'll understand some of this. So there's clearly this issue of externalities. So externalities are, there's a transaction going on between I'm buying petrol or I'm putting petrol in my car, driving my car into town, and I have a transaction with that oil and gas company to give me the petrol and I benefit. I've got a nice car, I can drive into town. Externalities are the impact on all the people who aren't involved in that transaction. So the people who live alongside that road that are suffering from air pollution. And externalities are a really important issue, and how you cost them and how you look at them. And one of the problems I would argue we've got with the energy transition at the moment is largely benefiting the rich and the well-off. Electric cars, poor people don't buy electric cars. Hydrogen fuel will be very expensive, so the rich nations will be able to afford it. The country with the highest uptake of EVs in the world is Norway, which also happens to be the richest country in the world. And the problem you've got is that the energy transition also has externalities for other communities. And I can think of a couple of examples. So electric vehicles, the battery uptake requires a lot of raw material. And one of those raw materials is cobalt. Cobalt is sourced, a lot of it is sourced from the Congo. The people who work in the Congo are earning low wages, working in incredibly dangerous conditions, and are dying relatively young to service that need for cobalt, which benefits multinationals. Almost none of that money is going back into the local community, so we can drive electric cars. The other classic energy transition, which had a massive externality, which I understand, is the coal industry in the UK. At one time, the coal industry in the UK was the biggest coal industry in the world. We have the highest quality coal in the world, still pretty dirty. And I grew up in a mining town, and I remember what happened to that community when the coal mine closed down. So there's not just this, so clean and green doesn't necessarily mean sustainable. So there's an element that needs to come into this, that there's this concept of something called energy justice. So within this transition, there has to be justice for those communities. So the innovations you choose will have externalities. And the problem with a free market is that free markets have market failures where the externalities are not compensated for. And the externalities for climate change are intergenerational. We're not going to pay for the externalities, the next generation are. And the hardest thing to cost into any society is a consequence for the next generation or the generation after that. So we're asking the generation of today to pay for the externality of something that will happen in the future. And so that's a really interesting point. So you might argue, and I might argue, for example, hydrogen is not sustainable. It's clean, but it's not sustainable. And its externalities mean that only the rich will benefit from clean energy. And the poor will have no energy because of the efficiency. So I think it's a really important point.
Good. Thanks, Simon. Just looking at the time, I think we should aim to wrapping up. I just want to see, are there any final comments from the panel? There aren't any further questions, so yeah, and any concluding remarks from yourselves would be good.
I just think it's a great subject. You could talk about it endlessly.
Yeah, I agree. It's very fascinating.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see where we how some of those issues are solved over time, and you know, how we bring it together as a society. For sure.
Yep. And I think Simon really, point out the root cause for some of the failure of innovation, not benefiting people in general. I think that's a good insight.
Yeah, I guess my final message is it's complicated. It's very complicated. In this energy transition, if we don't think about the social aspects and we don't include people into the dialogue who aren't engineers, who aren't scientists, social scientists, artists, there needs to be a much more diverse conversation around what energy transition really means in terms of global justice, in compensation for the externalities that both climate change has created, but also the externalities that energy transition will create. So energy transition will have an impact on a larger number of communities around the world who rely on industries that are invested in the current system. It'll also, as we need more and more resource to implement energies that are less effective, they're lower quality, they're lower density, they don't give you as big a bang for your buck, more and more resources potentially sucked into developing nations, which leaves undeveloped nations in the same position they've been for the last 100 years with very little access to energy. And that's the big challenge.
Okay, thanks, Simon. So just to finish this session then, I meant to mention it earlier, but I'll mention it now. So I think our next session, we're planning again to middle of June, tentatively penciling in 16th of June, and we're hoping to get together a topic and and a panel that comprises of the Greenhouse Climate Innovation program that we're currently going through Imperial. So that carries on from the innovation theme, but we'll hear a little bit more from some of the other companies involved in trying to set up their own startups. So thank you very much, all those that have joined. Thank you very much, Henry, Ian, and Wen, for joining us today. This is great. So the session's been recorded, so we'll make the recording available later. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm just going to end the recording now. Thank you.
Very good. Bye bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.